This book encourages parents to abuse their children and has sadly sold over 1 million copies. Quick trigger warning, there is violence, child abuse, murder, and religious abuse mentioned. Hi, I'm Danny. After watching the 2023 documentary Shiny Happy People Dug Her Family Secrets, I decided to read the book they discussed.
Michael and Debi Pearl's book To Train Up a Child was the endorsed book by Gothard.
Let's see what they teach.
That child is going to have authority. Mother, you got to let that man be the authority.
Punish him with the rod severely. If he screams too hard with the first five, gets hysterical, wait. A little psychological terror is sometimes more effective than the pain.
As mentioned, this book was written and self-published by Michael Pearl, an American independent Baptist preacher, alongside his wife, Debi Pearl. They are the heads of a nonprofit called No Greater Joy Ministries and are the parents of 5 children. They are fundamentalist Christians. Horrifically, Debi had a crush on Michael when she was 13 and he was 18. They didn't get married until years later, but they also never truly dated or even courted. Their lives revolve around Debi writing books about wives submitting to their husbands, and Michael tells stories of how men cannot be silly and must be strong and be the head of the household. Nothing toxic going on here.
Eddie, all over your head. You shouldn't have done that at 7 years of age.
Okay. Yeah, but that hurts, and I'm 50.
Okay.
I
But there aren't any marks on you?
No, there's no. But you would hit a 5-year-old like that?
Yeah.
Although they would never admit it, Michael and Debi wrote To Train Up a Child to appeal to selfish parents. Parents whose only goal is to use their children to feed their egos. Look how well behaved my children are. Look at what a wonderful Christian I am. As I mentioned, this book recommends various abusive tactics for parents to use on their children to break their will. But heartbreakingly, it has been linked to the death of 3 different children who were all homeschooled: Sean Paddock, Lydia Schatz, and Hannah Grace Rose Williams. According to a New York Times article from 2011 that was written after the 3rd child's death, the Pearls say that blaming their book for extreme abuse by a few unstable parents is preposterous, and that they explicitly counsel against acting in anger or causing a bruise. They say that their methods, properly used, yield peace and happy teenagers. But the deaths of these babies tell me otherwise. The first death, Sean, was only 4 years old. Sean was one of 6 adopted American children in this family. When problems became overwhelming, the Paddocks turned to the internet and found the Pearls' website. Sean was wrapped tightly in a blanket and suffocated. His siblings testified that they were beaten daily as well. Lydia was only 7 when she died. She had been adopted when she was 4 from Liberia, and her parents ignored the book's warnings against extended lashings as they whipped Lydia for hours. She had died from severe tissue damage, and her older sister was hospitalized. Lydia was one of the 9 children homeschooled in that family. Hannah also died from the methods that the Pearls advocate for in this very book. Hannah and her brother were adopted from Ethiopia and were seen as rebellious by their parents. Officials determined she had died from hypothermia and malnutrition. Her parents had starved her for days and made her sleep in their cold barn or closet and shower outside with a hose. Of course, she was homeschooled, so people outside the family were not aware. They even whipped her on the day of her death, specifically with the 15-inch plastic tube that Michael Pearl recommends in To Train Up a Child. She was nearly 14 when she died. I had a tough time looking into these murders, and I have no idea how the Pearls live with themselves. I genuinely do not care if the book includes warnings about overusing these tactics, because to me, using them at all is overuse. To even advocate for disciplinary measures that can lead to death is fucking disgusting. However, Michael lives with a guilt-free conscience because the size of the plastic tubing he recommends in his book is too light to cause damage to the muscle or the bone. And of course, this man is pro-life. Crystal Lutton, who runs Grace-Based Discipline, one of the several Christian blogs that oppose corporal punishment, says it well by mentioning the danger with the Pearl's methods is that if you don't get results, the only thing to do is to punish harder and harder. What's also wild is the Pearl's children think the blame towards their parents is misguided. Their 28-year-old daughter said she had a wonderful childhood and is raising her children the same way. She says, "My parents never spoke to me in anger, and I can only remember being spanked a couple of times." Michael Pearl says he spanked her about 50 times total, and it eventually became unnecessary. Before getting into the reading, I also want to note that this book was endorsed by the Institute in Basic Life Principles, the IBLP. Many fundamentalist Christians do believe that babies are sinners, and physical punishment may help steer them into the righteousness of God. Now, let's dive into what this horrendous book recommends parents do to get their child to obey. As a disclaimer, before reading this book, I want to state very clearly that I am not a parent. However, I have been a babysitter for about 12 years and was a full-time nanny for well over a year. While I may not have my own children, I also am capable of understanding children and am surrounded by them constantly. Believe it or not, I also was a child at one point. It is my belief that I do not need to experience something firsthand to have opinions on it. After all, the qualifications for becoming a parent are close to non-existent. Additionally, this is a summary of what stood out to me in the book. If you feel I am taking things out of context, feel free to purchase and read the book yourself. In this video, I am making an argument against the Pearls. However, I do pull texts that I agree with as well. The copy that I'm reading has a copyright of 1994, but this is the 13th edition. As the page reads, this 13th edition is actually a revision. We have maintained all original material, but some of the text has been altered to improve readability. Occasionally, a sentence or a phrase has been added to better express the original intent. Now, I personally hate the use of the word training when it comes to raising a child. However, we use it all the time. Potty training and sleep training are some examples. I also understand it comes from Proverbs 22, a chapter in the Christian Bible. So, train up a child is a common phrase within the religion. The book begins by comparing a parent who looks exhausted and is not in control of their kids and a mother who has trained them well. One interesting thing I found about this example is the exhausted parent is the one who spanked her kids. The Pearls also use the devil's number when they write, "She said no 666 times in the space of 2 hours," versus the other mother who did not spank her children while at Michael's house, and she did not need to rebuke them. But I was skeptical at what this second mother did to create such obedience in her children. So I read on. But then Michael begins comparing human children to dogs and says, where there is an absence of training, you can no more rebuke and whip a child into acceptable behavior than you can the family dog. No amount of discipline can make up for a lack of training. So to me, it sounds like Michael's goal is to rebuke and whip their young before they even understand why the behavior is unacceptable to their parents. Side note, he then starts comparing the family unit to the military, and as someone currently in the military, absolutely not. His sentence even starts with, "When headstrong young men join the military." I think Michael might die if he found out women are in the military too. I also want to be clear that the military, at least not in my 3 years of experience, maybe this was true 30 years ago though, does not condition us to instant, unquestioning obedience, as Michael explains. The orders that are given do have to be lawful. He continues to compare children to animals and talks about how horses that pull buggies learn to not only respond to a command, but the tone at which it's said. And children are the same way. If you have trained him to respond to a bellow, don't blame him if he ignores your first 13 suggestions while waiting for your revered pitch to reach the point where he interprets it to be a real command. Considering your child speaks the same language as you and horses do not, I don't understand the comparison and don't see the argument being made. Now, this section really confused me. He says the intention is to train up a child, not beat up, not discipline up, not educate up, not positive affirmation up. He says training is the conditioning of a child's mind before the crisis arises. It is preparation for future, instant, unquestioning obedience. Where is the human in all of this? Where is the individuality of the child? I'm guessing that is not something Michael wants his children to have, and that is heartbreaking to me. Believe it or not, parents don't know everything, and a child inquiring about why a rule has been set is a good thing. Then the hitting begins. When Michael suggests you put an object you don't want them to touch in an area and then swat at their hand while saying no when they grab it. He continues with further examples of an infant pulling your hair or grabbing your glasses. He even has the audacity to compare this training with God putting the apple tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden. Then things get really disturbing to me when Michael suggests mothers pull their infant's hair when they bite down during breastfeeding. And, of course, an alternative has to be sought for bald-headed babies. In all of these training scenarios, Michael emphasizes this isn't discipline, but training. He states the spanking is not punishment, it is to give weight to your words. This is just so wild to me because it makes no sense. He also claims a human is never too young to train, and a newborn baby crying is manipulative. Then he brings out the infamous rod. One of our girls who developed mobility early had a fascination with crawling upstairs. We attempted to train her not to climb the stairs by coordinating the voice command of no with little spats on her bare legs. The switch was a 12-inch long, 1/8 inch diameter sprig from a willow tree. We later observed her crawl to the stairs and start to ascend, only to halt at the first step and stare at the switch. She backed off and never again attempted to climb the stairs, even after the switch was removed. I genuinely didn't expect Chapter 1 to cover all of this. What do the next 94 pages say? Michael carries on by shaming a father who proudly hits his kids in front of company, but did not have control of his kids. Michael says, I wondered why, if he was so firm and faithful to gain obedience, he had not achieved it before entering the public arena. I was impressed, but not in the way he hoped. And this really sums up the Pearls and fundamental Christianity well. It's a show. I would even argue this is common to Christian families in general, not just fundamentalists. They want people to be proud of this beautiful family they've created that obeys and is quiet. They don't want children, they want decorations. They want control. I mean, he continuously calls the public space arenas. It's a display. It's not about the kids being kids, it's about making sure they maintain a perfect reputation for their parents. Look at these words he uses to describe children. Parents who purchase compliance through promise of reward are turning their child into a racketeer, paid for protection. The child becomes the mafia or union boss, and you take the role of intimidated businessman. If you are bargaining with a terrorist for one more day's reprieve from anguish, may you then strike a favorable deal. But if you are training up a child, you need to reconsider your methods. Allowing yourself to be intimidated into compromise will turn your child into a psychological bully. We are talking about children. But thankfully, that concludes Chapter 1. I wasn't sure if it was ever going to end, although it was only 12 pages. I'm scared to go on. Chapter 2 begins with Michael saying a 1-year-old throwing a bottle on the ground and crying was enough to make you believe the devil started as an infant. The chapter is titled Childish Nature, and in summary is about how children are born needy and selfish and must learn and grow to know how to be responsible and respectful. Michael argues that it is a parent's job to condition the child to what is good before he himself can decide. This is a point I don't entirely disagree with because this is a huge part of a parent's role. I was also shocked to find that Michael doesn't regard these selfish actions of the child as sin. Many fundamentalists would disagree. However, he does say that sin is eventually inevitable as we have free will. Ultimately, that all of our flesh is bound for sin, and we have to rebel against this innate evil. There will come a time when your child must stand alone before the tree of knowledge of good and evil. As the purpose of God has permitted, he will inevitably partake of the forbidden fruit. Now, in the developing years, you can make a difference in how he will respond after he has eaten. But that's it for chapter 2. Only 8 pages of him repeating himself over and over. We are now about 1/5 of the way through the book. Chapter 3 is titled Parental Anger. Right away, Michael makes the argument that there are no warnings when a child disobeys their parent. After 2 days of mother rewarding every transgression with a spanking, rewarding is a very interesting choice of words, Johnny turned to her and said, "But mother, you are not giving me any more chances." The mother said, "That's right, you don't get any more chances. From now on, I will expect you to obey the first time." In this argument, he is trying to say that a parent's anger will not show up if they don't allow their child to disobey. He says, if your child does not see consistency in the lawgiver, in his mind, there is no law at all, just competition for supremacy. I don't even entirely disagree with this statement, but I'm not at all convinced that the only way to get them to listen is to hit them. God forbid you explain the reasoning behind why we don't do things like that. Michael would truly die if he ever hears about gentle parenting. I find it so interesting how this book is just a million little testimonies from Michael's point of view of the success stories using his methods. I'm not thinking Michael is a very humble man. The chapter ends with him talking about it being a parent's fault that they don't like their child. He uses an example of a 14-year-old who the mom claimed to have an attitude problem. Michael argues that the child is a very good and obedient daughter, but that her mother's irritability was what pushed the daughter away. Honestly, and surprisingly, not the worst advice. What I think is being stated here is that a child will grow up into an adult and will be interested in and do things that a parent may not love or had imagined. However, as a parent, you have to check yourself when it comes to the standards and expectations you put on your child. Chapter 4 is titled Tying Strings. It took a whole 26 pages, but I finally found a paragraph I thoroughly love and support. It is important that sons and daughters be able to trust their parents with personal, intimate knowledge. If there is a barrier in this area, when the time comes that they need counsel, to whom shall they go? The feelings of a child are just as important and sacred as those of an adult. Always treat your children with respect. Never ridicule, mock, or laugh at your children's ideas, creations, or ambitions. The trust you desire to have when they are older must be established and maintained when they are young. If you have an older child with whom you have failed in this area, it is not too late to apologize and reestablish that trust. It may take a while to earn their confidence, but it can be done. I could make the argument that some of what he says here seems to contradict his advice towards training your child. However, I really want to just enjoy a moment where he isn't saying something highly questionable and controversial. I also find this statement interesting considering how common it seems for children of fundamental parents to run off and never talk to their parents again. It seems Michael is trying to argue that this is the parents' fault for not nurturing or loving their child in the way they need to be nurtured and loved. This seems to go against everything we've seen from the Plaths, Duggars, and the Meggs families. It's nice to see Michael suggesting these families need to find some humility and apologize. Compared to the first chapter, it seems Michael is doing a better job establishing a level of trust and respect with a child that would then make that child want to respect their parents. I will never agree with using hitting or any type of violence to get a child to listen, but I can support building trust and respect. I also appreciate his continuous emphasis on the importance of spending time engaging with the child. Parents, if you're going to use this book as a parenting guide, skip chapters 1 through 3 and go straight for chapter 4. But of course, this high had to come crashing down, and chapter 5 is titled The Rod. According to Michael, Proverbs 13:24, which in the New Living Translation says, "Those who spare the rod of discipline hate their children. Those who love their children care enough to discipline them. Michael clearly states that a failure to apply the rod is due to the parents hating the child. I'm not going to go into my opinions on this, as I don't believe the Bible is the Word of God. At least not the poorly translated English Bibles. I think I've made it clear that I don't agree with using physical means to discipline your child. If Michael's following statement is true, I don't think I believe or support this so-called God at all. Michael is amounting the rod up to be spanking. The God who made little children and therefore knows what is best for them has told parents to employ the rod in training up their children. To refrain from doing so based on a claim of love is going against God himself. Your actions assume that either God does not desire what is best for your child, or you know better than he. Michael does make it clear that these spankings should never be done in anger, and I think that is extremely important. It even supports his argument as to why the tragic deaths mentioned earlier do not align with what he teaches in this book. And just when he makes a good point, he makes a bad one by saying the modern parent is bombarded with propaganda, supposedly based on the latest psychological research, which villainizes biblical-based children rearing. Parents are shamed and must look over their shoulders before applying discipline. I'm not sure what psychological studies tell parents not to discipline their children, but there's plenty of research against using physical means to get a child to listen to you. I want to make the point that the men who wrote the Bible did not have access to this modern day research, nor did they live in the cultures of 2024. I understand many Christians believe what these various men wrote then became the Word of God and that our modern culture is evil. But I will always believe reading in the context of the writer, as well as their location and time frame, is arguably more important than the text itself. But Michael continues with his distaste of modern psychology. Taking their cue from secular wisdom, misguided parents try to build up their child's self-image through positive affirmation. It is nauseating to see parents trying to purge their children of guilt with empty, sweet words. It is nauseating to read this book. Michael argues that the more that one loves himself, the deeper the self-loathing. So yeah, I personally wouldn't be taking any advice from him, at all. He continues, do not follow the modern philosophy of trying to eliminate guilt by fudging on the standards or by pumping the guilty child up with false worth. Keep the standards high as the person of Christ. Let the guilt come, and while the child is yet too young to understand, purge the guilt by means of the rod. When understanding finally comes, he will readily grasp the principles of the cross. All right, so just to make sure I got this right, treat your child with respect, but also don't build up their confidence because they are unknowingly sinning and must be punished. They do not need to know why it's wrong, but just that it is wrong. Through these punishments, they will eventually understand why their Savior, Jesus, was brutally murdered on the cross. All right, well, that makes no sense to me and worries me that it probably makes sense to a lot of people. This paragraph on page 41 is very concerning to me. Proper use of the rod gives new hope to a rebellious child. Parents are exhorted to not allow the child's crying cause them to lighten up on the intensity or duration of the spanking. Parents' emotions can stand in the way of a thorough cleansing. I'm sorry, what? I thought Michael was just saying our conscience guides us or whatever. If a parent is heartbroken to spank their child, that should tell you the intensity and duration are pretty likely not good. As I mentioned earlier, there is no actual requirement to becoming a parent. If you get pregnant, you are able to have and raise the child. You are not God and should not refer to the discipline of your child as a thorough cleansing. Ew, to everything he wrote there. All right, I think chapter 5 was worse than chapter 1. Unfortunately, chapter 6 is titled Applying the Rod, so we're not done here. I want to preface that the next part is incredibly hard for me to read out loud. If you have to sit on him to spank him, then do not hesitate, and hold him there until he has surrendered. Prove that you are bigger, tougher, more patiently enduring, and are unmoved by the wailing. Defeat him totally. Accept no conditions for surrender, no compromise. You are to rule over him as a benevolent sovereign. Your word is final. Yeah, this is abusing your child. This is disgusting. But don't worry, he has boundaries, like not spanking with your hand, because that's the problem here. Any spanking to effectively reinforce instruction must cause pain. It is most effective to strike the rod against bare skin, where nerves are located at the surface. A surface sting will cause sufficient pain with no injury or bruising. Select your instrument according to the child's size. For the under 1-year-old, a small 10 to 12 inch long willowy branch, stripped of any knots that might break the skin, about 1/8 inch in diameter is sufficient. Sometimes alternatives have to be sought. A 1-foot ruler or its equivalent in a paddle is a sufficient alternative. For the larger child, a belt or larger tree branch is effective. Honestly, I take back any slightly nice things I have said about these pearls. Michael and Debi are disgusting in not only using these methods on their children, but encouraging others to do the same. But he continues to tell parents, never spank a child when you're angry. If you're finding yourself agreeing with what my opinions are, you'll be pleased to see Michael wrote a paragraph about us. There is a political movement to outlaw spanking. They say if you hit a child, he will grow up to be violent. The people who advocate rodless training do not believe in the Bible. They judge others by their own experience. The only time they have hit their child or been tempted to is when they are angry. They are correct in saying that what they call hitting the child may cause him to grow up and use violence as a way of resolving conflicts, but they do not understand that Christian heart. Having never experienced it, they cannot fathom the self-restraint and love that motivates true Christians. As someone who grew up in the Christian church, I'm not sure what point he is saying here. I didn't believe in spanking when I did believe in the Bible. I don't think a lot of people who grew up under fundamentalist parents would agree that their parents had self-restraint and love when they were beaten. And after 46 pages, Michael finally suggests you also talk to the child about their behavior. He calls this reproof and uses Proverbs 29:15 to apply it biblically. You explain his behavior is unacceptable and offer suggestions on how he should conduct himself. But this explanation follows the beating when the child is hurt and probably in distress. Cool. Chapter 7, The Philosophy of the Rod, is only 2 pages long and is just Michael continuing to argue that this is what God wants for these children. We are now on page 49 out of 102, which means we're nearly halfway through this wretched book. I am exhausted and frustrated reading this. It has taken me a week to get to this point in the script. I find myself so sad after reading this book, but I needed to know if it was as bad as people have made it seem. I have already concluded it is. We have gone through 7 of the 21 chapters, which means these chapters will mostly all be shorter now. Titled Selective Subjection, Chapter 8 is Michael's argument that a well-trained child knows not to only obey his parents, but to be obedient to the rule of law. He uses an example of a 2-year-old who wasn't listening to his 14-year-old sister. Because Debi was in charge of these kids, Debi began disciplining the 2-year-old with spats on her hand while saying no. It turns out this was meant to be Debi demonstrating to the 14-year-old to do the same, but without the spats. So now we've got young teenagers disciplining their toddler siblings. This is a great idea. And here's one of my most significant issues with these large Christian families. Furthermore, the older children will be more responsible when given responsibility over the younger children. And what a load it takes off the mother. I'm sorry, was it the mother and father that brought the child into the world, or the sibling? Who should be responsible for raising the child? Hint, not the sibling. But they argue that when 2 children are together, one should be in charge. The book moves on to talk about mothers that struggle to discipline with the rod and step in front of their husband, the father, when he begins the beatings. He makes the argument that a parent should never correct the other parent's judgment. And while I agree parents should do their best to discuss their parental styles and goals, if, say, a father is being too rough and a mom steps in, I don't see the issue. But Michael does, because these kids aren't getting beaten. He writes, "It is better for your child if you support an occasional injustice than to destroy the authority base by your open division." Huh? If I was getting beaten by my father and my mother just stood there, I don't think my relationship with either of them is gonna be great. But Michael says that when a child is receiving a punishment and calls out for the other parent should then begin dealing the punishment. I guess it teaches the kid that one parent is enough. He concludes with this disgusting paragraph. Mother, if you think your husband is too forceful in his discipline, there is something you can do. While he is away, demand, expect, train for, and discipline to receive instant and complete obedience for your children. When father comes home, the house will be peaceful and well ordered. The children will always obey their father, giving him no need to discipline them. Horrible and disgusting. Chapter 9 is titled Training Examples. I find that funny considering every single chapter in this book has included examples so far, but let's see what we can learn and hopefully ignore from Michael in these 9 pages. It begins by talking about a 2-year-old boy that keeps hitting his mom. Michael writes this out-of-pocket statement. This was not new behavior. We had previously observed him follow in the footsteps of Cain as he perpetrated acts of violence on his little brother. I'm sorry, but hitting your brother is not comparable to killing your brother. That is an insane comparison. Then Michael finally brings up parental abuse upon the mother, telling the child to stop hitting her because it hurts. He writes, I'll tell you what hurts. It hurts to see a mother abuse her child by doing nothing while her responses are making a criminal out of little Johnny. All right, so Michael defines abuse a heck of a lot differently than I do. Good old little Johnny then starts hitting Debi Pearl, so she grabs the toy and hits him back. Shockingly, Michael clarifies this isn't discipline, but training. After several blows, Johnny's mom also starts whacking him with the toy. In summary, according to Michael, meeting a bigger bully cures most little bullies. When describing the next example, this is how he talks about spanking. His mother then administers about 10 slow, patient licks on his bare legs. He cries in pain. If he continues to show defiance by jerking around and defending himself, or by expressing anger, then she will wait a moment and again lecture him and again spank him. When it is obvious that he is totally broken, she will hand him the rag and very calmly say, Johnny, clean up your mess. How old do you think this little boy is? If you guessed 3, you'd be correct. Michael also has the audacity to claim that these spankings make a child emotionally stable. He shares a few more stories with the same lesson, but I want to pause to read his view on Barbies. All children's dolls should be baby dolls, not Barbie dolls. The fantasy arising from playing with Barbie dolls causes a child to role-play a sex goddess. Although I was by far a Bratz girly, right up until middle school, I didn't know what sex was, let alone a sex goddess. Also, have you ever seen a toddler play with a baby doll? It is not a motherly sight. The final story is about Debi babysitting. Michael does establish when they babysit for other people, it is always on the condition that they will have full liberty to discipline and train. This story is about a 15-month-old that has a bad attitude, and Debi begins spanking him with her switch. And they believe the child started behaving better because of this training, not because of fear. Chapter 10 is called Safety Training. This chapter is Michael taking us through various situations of training a child the items that are off limits by using the switch when they attempt to grab said object. Some examples are guns and hot stoves. It's interesting to me though because I never had to be spanked or hit to not touch a hot stove, and I never burned myself either. It's almost as if there could be other ways to teach children. He then talks about a pond they had in their yard and how they basically just let their kids fall into it to learn respect for the water. Splash. In she went. I restrained my anxiety long enough for her to right herself in the cold water and show some recognition of her inability to breathe. When panic set in, mine as well as hers, not to mention her mother's, I pulled her out and scolded her for getting close to the pond. She didn't swallow any water, and there was no need for resuscitation, except on my wife, who took several hours to begin breathing normally. We repeated the same process with all the children. It only took one time for each of them to learn respect for the water. He does clarify at the end that you should not try this unless you are sure that you can maintain full control of all circumstances. I would argue that no one can, so yeah, don't do this. Safety is essential, don't get me wrong, but there are much safer ways to teach children how to float and, as they get older, to swim. He ends this chapter by referring to himself as the general of a household and brags about his ability to basically make the children do whatever he tells them to. This may sound cold and harsh. I hope it doesn't, for it was warm, friendly, loving, and produced confident, calm, hardworking, loyal children and adults. In actuality, because of our consistency, the children were seldom spanked. I think Michael and I have different definitions of seldom. However, even if he and Pearl were perfectly capable of delivering these spankings calmly, I do not believe Michael nor Pearl never hit their children in anger, but this is what they claim. Titled Potty Untraining, Chapter 11 is about their ability to potty train infants. I think any parent would agree that changing 1 million diapers a day and paying for diapers is an absolute pain. So as long as Michael and Pearl were safe when placing the baby on the toilet, I see no issue with this and actually find it quite cool. Not all cultures around the world have the luxury or need for diapers, and I love that for them. Where things change is when Michael recommends parents that have older toddlers that are still not potty trained should use the hose instead of baby wipes when changing their child's diaper. With the autumn chill and the cold well water, I don't remember if it took a second washing or not, but a week later, the father told me his son was now taking himself to the pot. I'm also not convinced that Michael has any idea what a 3-year-old talks like, because when he writes the dialogue of a boy who isn't allowed sweets until he is potty trained, he writes it like this. After watching the other children receive their powdered sugar, the forlorn fellow said to Mama, "I sure do like my powdered sugar on my French toast." "I know you do," she said, "but you are not old enough yet." After his deprived breakfast of plain French toast, he climbed down, walked around to his mother, and with all the soberness of one making a revolutionary lifetime decision, he announced, "Mother, I am ready to stop wearing a diaper. Take it off." To be fair, I wasn't raised in a fundamentalist household, so maybe this is how their kids talk. The chapter ends with a disclaimer from Michael about not using any of these methods toward a bedwetter, as they are not doing it consciously. I appreciate this disclaimer. However, I would suggest not using these methods at all, ever. Titled Child Labor, but is only 4 pages long, so I hope it's not too horrible. Now, I don't know much about Amish culture or beliefs, but I don't love this perspective this specific family has on children. Michael writes, "My Amish neighbors say that before 7, the children are a drain on the family. Between 7 and 14, they pay their way. After 14, they become an asset bringing in profit. By the time a child reaches 7, he should be making your life easier. A house full of 7-year-olds ought to be self-sustaining. I do not plan to have kids so that they can make my life easier when they're older. Children can absolutely help by cleaning up their toys and wiping down the counters, but they don't need to be bringing in profit. So much of this book is about whipping these babies into shape so your life is easier later on. You know what's easier? Not outrageously outnumbering yourself with children." And Michael is generous enough to include this lovely section. "A mother should always keep in mind that she is molding her daughters into future wives and mothers. Challenge them with sewing, cooking, cleaning, learning about everything." That reminds me of someone.
The whole thing, cooking 3 meals a day, that is one of the only keys to a man's heart. When's the last time you cooked a meal?
No, not that one.
Because I think it is you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies told to you. How many of you are sitting here now, about to cross this stage, and are thinking about all the promotions and titles you are going to get in your career? Some of you may go on to lead successful careers in the world, but I would venture to guess that the majority of you are most excited about your marriage and the children you will bring into this world.
Ah, yes, such a lovely message. But the boys must also be doing the manly things because, according to Michael, if you leave your sons for the woman to rear, don't be surprised if at 16 they act more like daughters. And to all you liberals, don't let a coven of sodomites and socialists hiding behind the badge of professional psychologists reprogram your natural feelings on male and female distinctiveness. A boy needs a man's example if he is to grow up to be a man. Are you as exhausted hearing this as I am? Now it's time to talk about attitude training in chapter 13. Although this paragraph seems to contradict many parts of this book, I do actually appreciate it. Training must consider the actions, but discipline should only be concerned with the child's attitude. It is embarrassing to see a parent upset at a child for spilling milk or acting his normal clumsy self. It gets mentioned over and over again throughout this book and within fundamentalism. But parents expect their older children to take care of their younger siblings. It is not an ask, but an expectation. So when a 13-year-old doesn't want to change her sibling's diaper, Michael blames the mother for not training her properly. The mother has several young children and a dread of several more on the way. That sentence alone is so disturbing. With all the responsibilities of homeschooling and natural living, she is too emotionally taxed to maintain responsibility for one as old as 13. Again, how about you stop expecting women to have more children than they can manage? I would highly recommend people not have more kids than you're capable of raising yourself as a parent. The Pearls think their way of raising humans is godly, and therefore they'll never think in a more progressive or socialist way. They deny science. Their kids also think this way and are judgmental towards any parents they see with kids that misbehave. This paragraph opens with, "My 9 and 11-year-old daughters came in from a neighbor's house, complaining of a young mother's failure to train her child." The child they are talking about is 7 months old, but Michael's 9-year-old told the mother if he is old enough to pitch a fit, he is old enough to be spanked. We have 8 chapters left. Chapter 14, Emotional Control, is hilariously short at only 3 pages, probably because the entire thing is about not allowing children or humans any big emotion. In one section, Michael basically makes fun of a little girl who begins screaming after getting stung by a bee. As he says, "For your children's own good, teach them to maintain control of their emotions. If you do not want to produce sissies that use adversity as a chance to get attention, then don't program them that way." The audacity to deny science but also say this sentence. He makes the argument that giving attention to a hurt child is training them to hurt themselves for attention. I don't want to talk about this any longer, but he uses self-harm as an example, and I find that so disgusting. To believe emotions are a terrible thing is one of my biggest disagreements with fundamentalists. A human is meant to feel. Titled Training in Self-Indulgence, Chapter 15 is Michael arguing that people are fat because we teach babies to self-soothe by putting things in their mouth, such as a bottle or pacifier. Chapter 16 is nearly 2 pages and is titled Bullies. For a second there, I was supporting his efforts as he gave an example of an older brother thriving off of picking on his sister. Michael explains how just telling the brother to stop won't fix the issue, but instead it should be explained that both kids should be having fun when playing. I agreed there. Then he writes, "Son, you know Hitler and his men had fun when others were suffering. They laughed while boys and girls cried in pain. Do you want to grow up to be like Hitler?" In complete brokenness, he says, "No, Daddy, I don't want to be like Hitler. I don't mean to make her sad. Sister, I am sorry." How does one say this to a child, write it down, and publish it without feeling at least a little weird about it? Michael is truly insane. The first sentence of chapter 17, titled Religious Whips, is funny to me because Michael obviously does not see the irony. He writes, "I have cringed at seeing parents use God to intimidate their children into obedience." As if this hasn't been a huge theme of this book, but more so targeted at parents than children. The 2-page chapter is about not using God or the Bible as punishments, as it may lead the child to abandon the belief when they're old enough. Titled Limitations, chapter 18 is also only 2 pages. I'm actually a bit confused what the purpose of this chapter was, but Michael uses examples of children performing their faith through words or songs and how no parent should encourage that. Chapter 19 is called Homeschool Makes No Fools. And I'm sorry I keep referring back to the Platts, but the Duggars can be grouped in here as well. Homeschooling raised a fair amount of fools in those families. He argues if you want a child who will integrate into the new world order and wait his turn in line for condoms, a government-funded abortion, sexually transmitted disease treatment, psychological evaluation, and a mark on the forehead, then follow the popular guidelines in education, entertainment, and discipline. But if you want a son or daughter of God, you will have to do it God's way. I have no words. Chapter 20 is a 7-page letter from Michael to his sons Gabriel and Nathan. It begins a list of what Michael wants his sons' future wives to have. He starts with saying she must love the Lord, and then says she must also be cheerful, thankful, a creative hard worker, and have a love for children. He shares this beautiful sentence. A girl who doesn't want her life encumbered with children is suffering a deep hurt and is walking a road to misery. Then Debbie begins her 2 pages for their girls, Rebecca, Shalom, and Shoshana Pearl. She writes, when you are peeved with him for some silly offense, remember, you are cutting off the prayer line. Don't allow hurt feelings to fester and disease the relationship. Be cheerful, thankful, and ready to forgive. Your children will watch you. If you show disregard, disapproval, anger, irritation, or dishonor to your husband, it will open the door for the children to do the same, not only to their father, but in a greater degree, to you. The last few pages are a conclusion where Michael doesn't really say anything. But what do you think? Are you a parent that would ever or do currently use these methods? Does this book advocate for abuse and violence toward children? What are your thoughts on the Pearls? Comment all of your thoughts below, and thank you for watching. Bye.